Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Cassie Brand and I am the curator of rare books at Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you all for joining us today for Anniversaries of Independence. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that your microphones are muted and that your video function is disabled. So please use the Q&A function to submit questions during the panel discussion. You can also use Q&A if you have any tech issues. The chat function is available but will not be monitored by our team. We are recording this webinar, which will include the chat transcription and the Q&A, but those will not appear when we post the video online. With the Zoom housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to introduce Denise Stephens, University Librarian and Vice Provost.
Good afternoon, I am Denise Stephens, and I'd like to welcome you to Anniversaries of Independence. I'm really glad to have all of you here with us today, and I'm sure we're going to have a great event. Since the beginning of the exhibit in 2018, the Declaration of Independence has been a cornerstone of our Independence Day programming. The declaration that all men are created equal is the quintessential expression of freedom sacred to our democracy. However, underlying the DOI's compelling eloquence remains the ongoing struggle to manifest its ideals. It's an expression of equality that was non-inclusive of enslaved people, indigenous people, indentured servants, women, and the poor. And there was, of course, no recognition of the LGBTQ community, just most recently visible in the wide and broad discussion of citizen rights. These peoples were not immediately granted rights so eloquently declared. For them, each step toward equality has been made through the efforts of countless individuals who work together to demand change. Progress has been made over generations of Americans through protests, marches, sit-ins, boycotts, and civil war. Today, as Black, Indigenous, and persons of colors are disproportionately affected by the COVID pandemic and are again marching with many allies, protesting and demanding change in the face of discrimination and police brutality, it is clear that we have yet to reach the ideals stated in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Acknowledging this tension between the Declaration's ideals and the lived experience of many of our fellow Americans, we're here today to celebrate two important milestones in the fight for equality and freedom. 2020 marks the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, as well as the founding of the American Civil Liberties Union, which continues to fight for equal rights today. I hope you are as excited as I am to learn more about these historic events through a dramatic reading and panel discussion. I now turn it over to Cassie Brand, our curator of rare books, to introduce the Declaration of Rights of Women of the United States.
Thank you, Denise. On March 31st, 1776, Abigail Adams wrote a letter to John Adams while he and the Continental Congress worked to form a new nation. Her letter says, quote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and in the new code of laws which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation," end quote. As Denise just noted, the Declaration of Independence declares all men created equal, and the ladies were indeed forgotten. Women were second-class citizens, unable to vote, represent in government office, or to serve on a jury. The Seneca Falls Convention was organized in 1848 to address women's rights, which sparked decades of activism and served as a first step toward equality for women. The convention adopted the Declaration of Sentiments, which called for equality between the sexes and urged for women to secure the vote. However, by the centennial celebration of the Declaration of Independence, there was still no progress. During an Independence Day celebration on July 4th, 1876, 5 leaders from the National Women's Suffrage Association were permitted to sit on the platform to observe the event, but were not permitted to share the declaration they wrote. After Senator Richard Henry Lee finished reading the Declaration of Independence, Susan B. Anthony, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, Sarah Andrews Spencer, and Lily Devereaux Blake, and Phoebe W. Cousins presented the Declaration of the Rights of the Women of the United States and distributed printed copies to the crowd. The authors of the Women's Declaration equated women's oppression by men with King George III's oppression of the American colonies and structured their speech in the same way as the Declaration of Independence, carefully outlining their articles of impeachment. Without further ado, I present Leanne Mathews to read an abridged version of the Declaration of the Rights of the Women of the United States, originally delivered July 4th, 1876.
While the nation is buoyant with patriotism and all hearts are attuned to praise, it is with sorrow we come to strike the one discordant note on this 100th anniversary of our country's birth. May not our hearts in unison with all swell with pride at our great achievements as a people, our free speech, free press, free schools, free church, and the rapid progress we have made in material wealth, trade, commerce, and the inventive arts. And we do rejoice in the success thus far of our experiment of self-government. Our faith is firm and unwavering in the broad principles of human rights proclaimed in 1776, not only as abstract truths, but as the cornerstones of a republic. Yet, we cannot forget, even in this glad hour, that while all men of every race and clime and condition have been invested with the full rights of citizenship under our hospitable flag, all women still suffer the degradation of disenfranchisement. The history of our country the past 100 years has been a series of assumptions and usurpations of power over women, in direct opposition to the principles of just government acknowledged by the United States as its foundation, which are, first, the natural rights of each individual; second, the equality of these rights; third, that rights not delegated are retained by the individual; fourth, that no person can exercise the rights of others without delegated authority; and fifth, that the non-use of rights does not destroy them. And for the violation of these fundamental principles of our government, we arraign our rulers on this 4th day of July, 1876. And these are our articles of impeachment. Bills of attainder have been passed by the introduction of the word male into all state constitutions, denying to women the right of suffrage and thereby making sex a crime. The right of a trial by a jury of one's peers was so jealously guarded that states refused to ratify the original Constitution until it was guaranteed by the 6th Amendment. And yet, the women of this nation have never been allowed a jury of their peers, being tried in all cases by men, native and foreign, educated and ignorant, virtuous and vicious. Taxation without representation. The immediate cause of the rebellion of the colonies against Great Britain is one of the grievous wrongs the women of this country have suffered during the century. And moreover, we are taxed to support the very legislators and judges who make laws and render decisions adverse to women. Unequal codes for men and women. Held by law a perpetual minor, deemed incapable of self-protection, even in the industries of the world, woman is denied equality of rights. The fact of sex, not the quantity or quality of work, in most cases, decides the pay and position. And because of this injustice, thousands of fatherless girls are compelled to choose between a life of shame and starvation. Special legislation for women has placed us in a most anomalous position. Women invested with the rights of citizens in one section, voters, jurors, office holders, crossing an imaginary line, are subjects in the next. The right of suffrage, once exercised by women in certain states and territories, has been denied by subsequent legislation. Thus, have our most sacred rights been made the football of legislative caprice, proving that a power which grants as a privilege what by nature is a right may withhold the same as a penalty when deeming it necessary for its own perpetuation. Representation of woman has had no place in the nation's thought. Since the incorporation of the 13 original states, 24 have been admitted to the Union, not one of which has recognized woman's right of self-government. Universal manhood suffrage, by establishing an aristocracy of sex, imposes upon women of this nation a more absolute cruel deposition than monarchy, in that woman finds a political master in her husband, father, son. The judiciary above the nation has proved itself but the echo of the party in power by upholding and enforcing laws that are opposed to the spirit and letter of the Constitution. When the slave power was dominant, the Supreme Court decided that a Black man was not a citizen because he had not the right to vote. And when the Constitution was so amended as to make all persons citizens, the same high tribunal decided that a woman, though a citizen, had not the right to vote. Such vacillating interpretations of constitutional law unsettle our faith in judicial authority and undermine the liberties of the whole people. These articles of impeachment against our rulers we now submit to the impartial judgment of the people. To all these wrongs and oppressions, woman has not submitted in silence and resignation. From the beginning of the century, when Abigail Adams, the mother of one president and the wife of another, said, "We will not hold ourselves bound to obey laws in which we have no voice or representation." Until now, women's discontent has been steadily increasing, culminating nearly 30 years ago in a simultaneous movement among the women of the nation demanding the right of suffrage. In making our just demands, a higher motive than the pride of sex inspires us. We feel that the national safety and stability depend on the complete recognition of the broad principles of our government. Woman's degraded, helpless position is the weak point in our institutions today. It was the boast of the founders of the Republic that the rights for which they contended were the rights of human nature. If these rights are ignored in the case of one half of the people, the nation is surely preparing for its downfall. Governments try themselves. The recognition of a governing and a governed class is incompatible with the first principles of freedom. Woman has not been a heedless spectator of events of this century, nor a dull listener to the grand arguments for the equal rights of humanity. From the earliest history of our country, woman has shown equal devotion to man for the cause of freedom, and has stood firmly by his side in its defense. Together, they have made this country what it is. Woman's wealth, thought, and labor have cemented the stones of every monument man has raised to liberty. And now, at the close of 100 years, as the hour hand of the great clock that marks the centuries points to 1876, we declare our faith in the principles of self-government, our full equality with man in natural rights, that woman was made first for her own happiness, with the absolute right to herself, to all the opportunities and advantages life affords for her complete development. And we deny that dogma of the centuries incorporated in the codes of all nations, that woman was made for man, her best interests in all cases to be sacrificed to his will. We ask of our rulers at this hour no special favors, no special privileges, no special legislation. We ask justice. We ask equality. We ask that all civil and political rights that belong to the citizens of the United States be guaranteed to us and our daughters forever.
Thank you, Leanne. That was so powerful. Though the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, achieved ratification on August 20th, 1920, this did not mean that there were no longer barriers facing those who wanted to exercise their right to vote. State constitutional loopholes were used to continue keeping many people from being able to vote in individual states. Election officials regularly blocked access to the ballot box, and use literacy tests, long residency requirements, and poll taxes to make it difficult to vote. Threats of violence, job loss, and intimidation were also used to keep voters, especially African American men and women, from voting. The Voters' Rights Act of 1965 was designed to enforce the right to vote, specifically for minority voters, and is considered to be the most effective piece of federal civil rights legislation enacted in the country's history. In spite of these guarantees, many citizens today continue to face barriers to voting, such as ID requirements, limited access to polling places, including closures and reduced hours, language barriers, lack of funding for elections, and voter roll purges. Voting is just one of the ways we can fight for change. By choosing representatives in local, state, and federal offices, we have partnered with the Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagement to provide some resources for voting on our event website. I have just added the link into the chat so that you can take a look at those voting resources, as well as our Make Your Own Declaration activity, in which we encourage people to declare a new civil right, and a virtual exhibit of our Declaration of Independence. Again, I'd like to thank Leanne Mathews for the reading. You can also find more information about Leanne on our website. And now I hand it over to Vernon Mitchell to moderate our panel discussion.